So we are going to, we have one more panel, and then we will have a break, and then we will have the kind of keynote presentation from Liam Young. So we're going to move into this next presentation fairly swiftly. It's called Devices, Sensors, Systems, Assembling the Drones. It's an interdisciplinary panel, including Sam Siewert, who is an engineer teaching at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in Prescott, Arizona, and he'll be joining us remotely via Skype. It also includes Dr. Ciara Bracken-Roche, who's joining us from Ottawa and is a surveillance studies scholar. And then it also includes Roushan, who's a trained architect and also currently pursuing her PhD at the European Graduate School. So maybe I'm going to forego more formal bios just for the sake of time. If there's key details that you want to include, please share them. And this panel will start with Sam, who we have queued up, followed by Ciara, and then Alla. Hello, Sam. How are you doing?
Good. How are you doing, Simon?
Very good. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, I also regret not coming to Toronto because we have 3 feet of snow here, and you are a couple of degrees warmer than we are.
There you go.
Which I didn't expect.
No, neither did we. So you're welcome to begin when you're ready.
Okay. So very interesting. I listened into the previous panel. And I think I'll go ahead and just start sharing my slides right away. And bear with me while I remember how to do that on Skype. It was obvious when I tested it. Now it seems less obvious. Let me see. I don't know if there's anything I need to do here. Oh, it just sort of popped up before. Now it's not popping up. Oh, there we go. I think that's going to be it. Share screen. And I'm just going to share my slides. Okay. And if I can, I'll go into slide presentation mode because then I think it's a little bigger. Is that okay? Can everyone see that all right?
Super clear, Sam.
Okay, excellent. So Embry-Riddle's heritage is aviation safety and security. The university was actually started in Ohio and moved to Florida for pilot training, commercial aviators, military, anyone who flies aircraft. And really it started in the, it was a quiz for myself. I don't remember the exact date, but we're about 80 years old. And so, in the 20s and 30s, at a time when general aviation was new. And interestingly enough, as I think has come up already, unmanned, unoccupied aerial systems and vehicles known as drones are very new as well. And of course, given our heritage, we almost had to embrace them and look at how to make them safe and secure and that sort of thing. So one of the things that's maybe different than some of the previous presentations is people are definitely concerned about drones, watching them. We are watching drones on our research project. And so that might be an interesting kind of a way of flipping things around a little bit. So some of the montage of images I have are some of the camera systems, radar, etc., both passive and active methods we have to observe drones. We use our campus as a lab, and it's an interesting environment because we are less than 5 miles from our airport, which is a commercial airport. We also operate our own pilot training flight line out of there. And so we are what in the U.S. we call Class D airspace. We have to contact the tower, and we have a standing waiver in order to operate drones on our campus. And so obviously safety and security is something that we need to take seriously given our location. And we have fairly high traffic, aerial traffic in our area, even though we're in a semi-rural location in the mountains in northern Arizona. We're situated roughly between Sedona and Flagstaff at about 5,500 feet. And I'll explain more of the instruments as we go forward. So the next slide shows what NASA to date has envisioned as a way of managing aerial traffic that includes shared airspace between general aviation and unmanned aerial systems. This, of course, makes a lot of people nervous, including pilots, for good reason. So there's perceived risks as well as real risks. And the start to this has been, I liken it to the Department of Transportation kind of came out and said, look, this is like anything. We need license plates, we need aerial freeways, and we need tracking devices. And otherwise, this won't be safe. So that's sort of the starting point for what's called NASA UPP, University Partner Program, Industry Partner Program, for allowing UAS to share airspace with general aviation. To be clear, today there are quite a few regulations, and generally, unless you're the military, you can't fly beyond line of sight, and you can't fly autonomous drones. And that is the current status in the United States. And I'll talk about that a little bit as we go forward. But what we wanted to do is consider an urban infrastructure, particularly urban, because we saw that as a bigger challenge than rural, that collaborates with drones in a network, hence the name DroneNet, and has almost what I would call an immune system for non-compliant drones. And everything in the system, including compliant drones, if they are compliant, self-localize, self-identify. So the camera systems, the sensors, and so forth, all know where they are located, mostly on rooftops of buildings, and communicate. And in fact, this could scale almost like the internet. We do work with some other universities, most notably University of Colorado. We've done some work with University of Alaska, where I came from before I started here at Embry-Riddle about 5 years ago. So, and our vision is probably more similar to what you would call intelligent transportation, but for aerial systems. We're looking at passive and active instruments, so radar, acoustics, or distributed ears on buildings, near-field eyes, so electro-optical sensors on the ground, observing and tracking drones, and wide-field eyes. So these are things like all-sky cameras. If you're not familiar, they're used to do things like track meteorites so you can find them, and quite effective. And so we've built these things ourselves here with students at University of Colorado and here at Embry-Riddle in Arizona. So probably of most interest to this group, and I love the interdisciplinary nature of this group, are the buildings, which, we have probably typical kind of engineering school buildings, not particularly interesting, but our campus does serve well as like I said, as basically a lab for us, and we're in a unique position to have something like this. We are not a designated NASA research site, but we have the ability, given our background, to be able to do this sort of thing safely and securely. So we've started to construct this lab using our aerospace experimentation fabrication building, where we have a EOIR camera, and I just showed where it is. We have radar and an all-sky camera we're actually putting up on our academic facility that we call AC1, where we already have weather radar. We have launch points for UAVs where we can operate line of sight, fairly sizable UAVs, for the most part, quadcopters, hexacopters, et cetera, rather than fixed wing, given the distances and speeds we want to deal with for urban. And then we have places we can put acoustic ears on buildings where it's difficult to mount more sophisticated instruments, like our planetarium and so forth. So I'll go through this relatively quickly, and if there are questions, we can always come back. Our location is semi-rural technically, but we're somewhat urban in a semi-rural location, if you will. So we are in Class D airspace, and you can see the FAA does not, of course, allow drone operations around the airport where you see all the zeros. And our campus is down here about 1.5 miles, 2 kilometers away from the runway at Ernst Love Field. Ernst Love Field has commercial service to Denver, Colorado, and Los Angeles on a daily basis. It has, of course, our flight line, and it has other civilian pilots. And so, roughly speaking, we just have to abide by these ceilings of operation and let our tower know when we're flying. So I guess that answers an earlier question. You can't operate around an airport as long as you have a waiver and as long as you abide by the rules that the FAA has for operation in Class D airspace. In the U.S. anyway, much like a helicopter or something like that. So why is there danger? So there's real danger. It's not just perceived. This shows an impact that occurred in Mexico on a 737. So I don't believe there are documented impacts other than this one prior to this occurrence last year. There's a lot of interest, so there's opportunity as well as challenges and potential risk for things like urban air mobility, air taxis, as well as things like parcel delivery or blood delivery for hospitals and things like that, which I'm sure people are aware of. And at the same time, there's security risks. So most likely, you may have heard about Gatwick's shutdown over the holidays. And if not that, there was also a shutdown at Newark Airport in the U.S. The really interesting thing about Gatwick to me is nobody's really sure whether there really were drones at the airport, but over 60 people reported sightings of drones independently. So there's strong evidence that there may have been drones, but there's no actual recorded kind of instrument-based observations of the drones or anything like that. Sharing airspace has challenge as well as risk. Our campus in Florida has a research project to assess those risks. We're looking more at how you would manage them. The opportunities, even at airports, are fairly substantial, like runway inspection could be done by drones, which at first almost sounds like, why would you want to do that? But it turns out that runway inspections are hard to do any other way, costly, and they're very critical to aviation safety. And in fact, a drone is almost the best device to do that, or one of the better ones. So our goal is to enable safe urban UAS operations, and the basic understanding is that you should trust UAS operations, but you need to verify that drones are compliant that are operating and determine when there are non-compliant drones, and hence DroneNet. So to go a little bit into both real and perceived risks, there's already been a lot of talk about military drones. And I think one of the things that I learned very early on getting into this is that because of the use of the word drone is military, which is an interesting point that Hillary made. Drones were designed to train basically the Navy to shoot down enemy aircraft. So really, I don't particularly like the use of the word drone either, but we used it because then everyone knows what you're talking about. So it really should be unoccupied or unmanned aerial system or aerial vehicle, or UAM, air mobility. There's a lot of fear, and some of it could be very real, some of it is just perceived. What I found interesting, this is very much like the time at which our university was founded in the 1920s and 30s. where the initial excitement in aviation turned into widespread fear of aviation, well documented by Matthew Dallek in Defenseless Under the Night. And really just created a almost debilitating aspect to general aviation that organizations like our university had to were able to help address. So I think our group saw this as, well, this maybe is, basically another time point in history where this needs to be done. Another interesting reference I have for the panel is Army of None, which does talk about military use of anything that is automated, including drones. And just some quotes from that. So it brings up for engineers, of course, the question of should we do things that we can do, right? Which generally by engineers are seen as policy issues. And sometimes we try to get out of, I guess, the line of debate there and say, well, we understand the technology. But I think, as engineers, we also have to answer those questions because, of course, we're all in this together. So the observation that I made that rang particularly true with some of the audiences I have is that history is not repeating itself, but it is sort of rhyming in that we have many of the same concerns about drones that we had about general aviation. And when you think about it, probably right now, not too many of us are concerned about general aviation. Many of you probably flew to Toronto. We generally consider general aviation a safe, positive thing, although it also has military uses. So one thing we thought of is, well, there just really isn't a lot of, there's air traffic control for general aviation. That's part of what makes us all feel safe with regard to general aviation. And, we don't have the same sort of thing for drones. One of the problems is that there aren't pilots involved with drones, and if there are, they're remote. So that changes things dramatically. So we looked at how could we build a system with automation on the ground to essentially verify that drones are operating as expected. So there's a lot of instruments. They're active and passive. They're multimodal. We're looking at how to lower cost so that anyone who wants to do this can do this. And building these systems in order to determine how well they work. The other reason we were motivated to do this is we saw that there were a lot of companies selling systems like this and not being as forthcoming with how well they work. We're, of course, a university nonprofit organization with no specific bias or set of objectives. So who better to assess these things and just present them than a university? That involves building some of our own instruments, and we hope in the future testing instruments as well. So, and for those of you not familiar with ADS-B was built as a replacement for ground radar. I don't know if it's just in the United States or not. I honestly don't know, but it stands for Automatic Dependent Surveillance Broadcast, which means almost nothing. But it's a replacement for radar where aircraft can identify themselves and give their position to each other so that ground radars and air traffic control don't have to get involved with the deconfliction of aircraft in flight corridors. It really was developed as a cost savings to the FAA in the US for air traffic control. And of course, a lot of people say, well, why don't you use that on UAVs? We don't think it's a very good idea. I'll just leave it at that. There's a lot of technical reasons for that, but that's a lot of our work. And we're looking at improved variations on ADS-B as well as ground systems, basically to watch the drones, if you will. And we, of course, can put these instruments on a drone itself, as well. And in some sense, in our view, then the drone just becomes an aerial node within the drone net, which otherwise is largely integrated into buildings in an urban environment. So how does this work? We have arrays of all-sky cameras and EOIR cameras around campus. We can cover our entire campus, which is roughly a 1 kilometer square area, for much lower cost than would be the case with just radar. And we believe we can cover it better. There are other hazards in these types of environments, like bird strikes. We happen to also keep the National Bird Strike Database for the FAA, so we have data on that as well. And essentially, we detect the drones in this hemispherical kind of airspace above an all-sky camera, and then cue a more higher resolution multispectral imaging tilt pan camera that can redetect and actually move toward identifying and fusing information in order to determine whether this drone is expected, compliant, non-compliant, etc. We're not trying to do anything about that. That's called counter UAS. It tends to be a military or security kind of thing, but our position is that you have to know what's going on before you do anything about a drone that's non-compliant or a threat to your campus or your urban environment. And so that fits well with our safety and security background. How do we do this? There's a lot of technical details, and we certainly have papers that we publish with AIAA, IEEE, and other kinds of organizations where you normally publish this kind of work. But to put it simply, we have a hemisphere of visibility in the sky, an all-sky camera. We can correlate that with acoustic data. And this is actually one of our planes with our pilots from our flight line for pilots that are being trained that we detected. So we can detect planes or drones. We can figure out where they are, their azimuth, elevation, etc. And we can determine whether there are dangerous scenarios for interaction between general aviation and drones. And things you could do with this are, for example, ground takeoffs from the airport, wave off incoming flights, and so forth. You basically can solve the problem that Gatwick had, right? Does the airport really need to be shut down or not, based on people who are pretty sure they saw drones operating, right? But not absolutely sure, not sure where they are, and that kind of thing. You also have forensic data in case someone operates drones in an area they shouldn't be operating them on a regular basis. This just shows the acoustic data. The acoustic, to me, is interesting. Our thought was, some of this comes from actually standing on rooftops myself, along with students, and observing aircraft and drones. And you realize you've got two round numbers, 50 megapixel with 6 megapixel detailed color. That's million pixels with your human eyes and your ears. And you can tell quite a bit about what's going on. So we're building instruments to do that. And of course, then we can use machine learning, machine vision to actually classify things in the air. Some of it is quite interesting. If you look at our video, you can see all the bugs and birds and general aviation and drones we have operating over our campus in time lapse.
Sam?
Yeah.
Sorry for interrupting. Could I ask you to maybe just make a closing statement, and then we'll maybe get to pick up some of these final things within a kind of conversation?
Yeah, no worries. I actually can just probably jump to my last slide. So the rest of this was what we're doing and kind of our status. But probably the most important slide to me is we're a large team of students, undergraduate, graduate, and faculty working here at Embry-Riddle and at University of Colorado. So I'd probably just close with that and take any questions when they come up.
So Sam, thank you so much. We'll have a quick round of applause. Ciara is going to present now, and I think we'll ask you to watch via the live stream. and then we'll call you back for questions once Alla has finished presenting.
Sounds good.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that presentation.
Great, thanks so much. Okay, we're on. Thanks everyone for being here today. Thanks to Simon for inviting me. This is very exciting to be part of this interdisciplinary conversation. I am a sociologist. I'm a surveillance studies scholar. So I'm coming at this from a different perspective. And I guess, based on our conversation earlier today, I wanted to start off by talking about what surveillance is. So we kind of touched upon this a little bit in the last panel, thinking about it through art. But when we're looking at our social world and thinking about the technologies that permeate our daily lives, what do we mean by surveillance? So drones, for example, by virtue of their cameras and all of the sensors attached to them, can do surveillance at any point. But when we think about surveillance, we want to think about it in terms of this definition, or at least that's how I think of it. And it's the purposeful, routine, systematic, and focused use of technology for the sake of control, entitlement, management, influence, or protection. So that's David Lyon's definition. He's seminal, the founder in the field of surveillance studies. And so just watching over is not what we mean when we think about surveillance, but it's about that routinization. So drones are capable of doing that all the time, but whether they are collecting data and doing it in those systematic ways, whether it's being sifted through in systematic ways, is another question. But it's something that we need to think about and be critical and proactive in terms of thinking about it as we move forward with the continued proliferation of drones in Canada and in terms of how we adopt regulations. So when we look at drones, I think of drones as being part of this digital network of data collection technologies that allow varying flows of information, new flows of information. The primary purchasers of drone technologies in Canada today are police and military organizations. The interesting thing as well, when I mapped out the drone space during my dissertation research, was that Canadian police and military tend to buy Canadian drones. There's a very close network of stakeholders that work together and kind of feed into one another. So I just thought that was kind of an interesting finding. And then I would argue that the drone economy's corporate, government, and military partnerships lead to regulatory developments in our domestic space that fail to address data protection, human rights, privacy, civil liberties concerns. And we'll come back to that. I'll say why I believe that's the case. So just to go through some of my findings. When I was carrying out my data, one of the interesting findings was about the regulatory working group. So at Transport Canada, the regulatory working group membership was found out through, I found it out through access to information and privacy requests. What I found out was that in 2012, during phase 1 of the drone regulations, 60% of the membership of that group was made up of industry stakeholders. That seems like a conflict of interest to me. So the people that are building the technologies are making up a majority of the people that are regulating the technologies. In 2016, during phase 2 of Canada's drone kind of regulations, and this is the precursor to what's coming out shortly in June, the number actually increased. So 62% of the membership of that group was made up of industry. So again, even after consultation with the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, with research groups such as the one that I was a member of, membership had just increased. What I found out through interviews was that stakeholders believed that the public and civil libertarians had no real understanding of what drones did, and that all of the concerns that people had were unfounded. So there were no privacy issues, that it was just a misunderstanding about the technology, that none of the drones were doing surveillance. And so the public was perceived to have absolutely no understanding of the technology. Public opinion data, though, in contrast to that, showed that individuals have a very nuanced perspective on what they appreciate the use of drones for. So they're very much for the use of drones in particular situations, but against it in other situations. And again, we'll come back to that. And I want to look at two cases. I find these illustrative when I'm thinking about my work. So when I think about policing the skies, I think about the physical element of it, of course, the fact that drones are from on high, we can be seen from the skies. And then I think about the regulatory element, the fact that the stakeholders who are building drones are the same people that are regulating them. And I think that creates a kind of weird hierarchy or vertical space within the regulatory space. On the left is an image from a peaceful protest on the Tyendinaga Reserve just outside of Kingston, Ontario. Protesters were there gathering against Harper's inaction around missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. The OPP came out to check out the protest one day. Seemingly a fracas occurred. Nobody's exactly sure what happened. And next thing, the OPP flew a drone over a peaceful protest on this rural side road over peaceful individuals who freaked out when they saw a drone. The police said it's a tool in our toolbox. The protesters on social media and in speaking to reporters said, no, this is a militaristic technology. You've escalated the situation. There was no need for it. And again, that shows the two differing perspectives between operators and stakeholders who are building and using drones and public who are subject to them. On the right is an image of the Aerion Scout. The Aerion Scout was an airly drone adopted by a number of police agencies in Canada. It was coming from Aerion, who were a startup at the University of Waterloo, and they came up with a kind of lease to buy program. So as they were starting to develop their drones and see what the various uses were, they were giving great rates to police forces in Canada. So the police forces, to an extent you could say, were acting as testing grounds for Aerion's new drone. What was more interesting than that was, again, through access to information and privacy requests, I was able to find out that the regulatory working group were working to deregulate the Aerion Scout. So the drone that all of the police agencies were testing out, they wanted to deregulate it. So again, it shows a conflict in terms of how we're regulating a technology, specifically one that would be used in sensitive situations. I would argue that a technology being used by the police out in public is a sensitive, topic, a sensitive situation, and that was what they wanted to deregulate. So what do these things show? I argue that these things lend themselves to a particular pattern of privilege within Canada's Dronescape. So we see key stakeholder groups involved in almost every aspect of drone development and deployment in Canada, while other groups, such as the public, are subject to the drones and don't have a role in regulating the technologies and don't have much of a role in developing them, of course, either. And this is more problematic because the excuse that the regulators are using, that the stakeholders are using, is that the public are wholly against drones. They're not aware of the technologies. Why would we include them in the conversation? But in fact, when we look at support for use by group, this was data collected through my research group in 2014 with Vision Critical, so slightly out of date now, but I mean, it was in contrast with the stakeholder opinions at the time, and it would still hold true, I would imagine. Law enforcement were among the highest in terms of support. So around 62% of the public said, for the most part, they would support the use of drones by law enforcement agencies. Whereas when we spoke to stakeholders, they said, no, the public will never support police using the drones. Now, when you break it apart, why do we say it's nuanced? Well, you know, nobody likes getting speeding tickets, for example. So when you look at the left side of our little drone diagram here, you see only 20% of support for police using drones for the purposes of giving out speeding tickets. You see 20% support for IDing people, you know, using video and facial recognition technology at sporting events. But then on the right side of that diagram, all of those positive uses receive very high levels of support. Also tend to be the uses where it's not that systematic, routinized surveillance and data collection. So things like disaster response, search and rescue, finding missing persons, hostage situations, all of those uses across the board received more support. Now, this was actually part of a broader 3-country study, and these results were quite consistent across the countries as well, just for your interest. So what I argue, and it kind of builds a little bit on the work of Eyal Weizman, and I'm sure that's work that you're very familiar with and hinted at in that last session, is that we end up with these vertical hierarchies. So we have it in the physical space where the operators are using that privileged eye from above to see down on the public. And we see it within the regulatory space where the government and industry stakeholders are shaping the drone technologies and the policy and just passing down that regulation to the public at large. And then I would argue, though, too, that we can see a different aspect of the use of drone technologies in terms of counter-surveillance. So when we think of protest spaces, there have been a number of occasions where protesters themselves, in turn, are flipping the switch, and they're starting to use their own drones to film police in spaces of controversy. So there is hope, but when we look at the state and public agencies systematically, routinely using data collection technologies, we need to be very critical about the logics that they're applying and who they're thinking of when they're using those technologies. So what I argue that this all demonstrates within Canada is that we have a technocratic approach to governance that challenges democratic principles. When everybody's not involved in the conversation, how can we make sure that technologies are being regulated and deployed in unbiased ways that are meant for the public good? Dominant discourses by the stakeholder groups ignore valid public concerns and public opinion on the technologies. And then the seemingly benign relationships that we see between the stakeholder groups aren't benign at all, and that they're the product of a revolving door within the drone space, of the surveillance industrial complex, if you will. So when individuals can move from the military realm into the regulatory realm and back into working on building drones for usage and for regulating and whatnot, it starts to get really sticky and problematic. And there's many conflicts in there that aren't interrupted. And on that note, I'll end, and I look forward to taking any of the questions you have.
Up next will be Ala Roushan.
Hi. Thanks, Simon, for the invite, and thanks for being here. It's been very interesting all day. So my discussion today is going to be slightly of a different tone. I'm coming at this from an academic research and my PhD, and also in my teaching at OCAD University, and also my current practice as a co-curator and director of Sugar, a space for contemporary art that's to open this fall down at Toronto's waterfront. And a lot of these conversations around technology and the drone I've been discussing with artists that I'm going to be collaborating with, one of whom you'll see his video playing in the background amongst other videos. But the way I frame the talk is sort of a speculative tone in a hope to maybe respond to Elle's comment about a slowing down and maybe looking at the evolution of the drone. And this is sort of saturated in my larger research of looking at animism and agency in emerging systems. So, okay, here we go. This will play in silent, sort of, the sound is off, right? Okay. So spirits, ghosts, and flying witches. If spirit, according to Hegel, is to make itself, in this case as spirit, the object of its own consciousness, and to comprehend itself in its interpretation of itself to itself, then I want to ask, can technological autonomous systems be of spirit? The reason I choose to speak of spirit, and specifically through Hegel, is my encounter with Persian philosopher Reza Negarestani's recent book, Intelligence and Spirit. I'm fascinated with how Negarestani formulates a functionalist perspective of the mind using Hegel's Geist, or spirit, to present new perspectives on human and post-human intelligence. Intrigued by this lens on spirit, I'm interested in the speculative potential of the drone as an intelligent object of having spirit. If an intelligent, conscious, cognitive condition is required to be of spirit, then can the drone be on the trajectory of evolving into spirit? So according to Negarestani, spirit is only what it does, rather than an essentialist perspective of what it is. And what it does, quote, is first and foremost realized by the sociality of agents. In the context of being human, this sociality is bound through the semantic space of language. Now, if we consider the future evolution of drone as multiple autonomous agents interconnected in its own language, then perhaps it can point to the emergence of a new ecology of spirited beings. A spirit that is part of a planetary cognitive ecology, one that places the human, other sentient beings, the technological objects, within systems of connectivity and exchange. So Catherine Hales, in her recent book, Unthought, The Power of Cognitive Non-Conscious, defined the state of connectivity as assemblage, as opposed to network. So, quote, she defines assemblages allow for continuity in a fleshy sense, touching, incorporating, repelling, mutating. Assemblages include information transactions across convoluted and involuted surfaces with multiple volumetric entities interacting with many conspecifics simultaneously, end of quote. In defining assemblage, Hales maps the topological space through which various autonomous spirits operate, interconnect, and converge. Autonomous drones and their increased agency perform as part of this assemblage, contributing to the planetary cognitive ecology or infrastructure that we are too part of. The drone intersects within its own species as swarm, as well as connecting back to the human and other conscious and unconscious cognitive entities that resonate in the world. The exoskeleton of the drone, augmented with cognitive and sensory mechanisms, enable it to touch, connect, and intersect within its swarming body, switching from singular to plural according to circumstance. And here, the rigid shell of the drone softens to embrace the dynamics of singular to plural, and what emerges as swarm is a flexible morphology. One might speculate that the tendency towards cognizant amorphous entity continues to shape the destiny of the drone, becoming more spirit in its evolution. Reza Negarestani, in Connecting Intelligence and Spirit, implicates the Hegelian Geist and what I hope to communicate when I refer to spirit. The semantic definition of the German word Geist in English includes ghosts, spirits, mind, intellect, revealing an interconnectedness in language to bind fiction and matter simultaneously. So our cognitive neurochemical conditions of mind and intellect meet the fiction of ghosts and spirits to form Geist. So either synthetic or biological, artificial or natural, Geist enables a ghostly spirit that defines intelligence. Drone swarms are evolving to operate beyond human physical controls, human sense perception, and human cognition. But the drone remains tethered to our myths, still part of a collective fantasy that shapes the trajectory of the drone evolution, and thus forever connected to a lineage of language and human imagination. This is a position of myths. Drones levitate to defy gravity and implicate the atmosphere. They are all-seeing and can penetrate through material obstacles, can move quickly through space, can win wars and conquer territories, connect to remote locations beyond human access, and have the potential to network in multiplicity as autonomous entities forming new kinds of synthetic intelligence. So the video clips playing in the background frames the drone in this way, not as tool, but as protagonist. Here the drone is no longer represented as extension of human, but illustrates an entity of its own spirit, suggesting that the future will manifest as a world that we have always imagined, with spirits, ghosts, and flying witches. Only this time, it is not an anthropomorphic projection of a broom with a cloaked female figure. The broom becomes electro-machine, and the female body transforms to non-human sensors, computational cognition, and network intelligence distributed within the swarm as multifrisk body. What I want to suggest is that our belief in spirit is twofold. Firstly, we have the spirit that has made us aware of our own consciousness. And secondly, we have spirit as myth and fantasy that conditions the way we design our world with spirits, endowing potential for new spirits to emerge through synthetic others we contribute to create. Our beliefs in myths signifies a capacity for human imagination in the human species to design and construct things beyond itself. It is a human condition that both builds resilience and plasticity, but also allows us fantasies to project into the world and reshape it. In Are We Human, Beatrice Colomignan-Markwigli defined the human, quote, by its diversity and plasticity, its ability to modify its own abilities. In redesigning itself, it redesigns the planet, but equally and simultaneously, the redesigned world redesigns the designing animal, end of quote. We designed myths and fantasies, fictions that sustain us. The psychoanalytic turn brought us to consider the unconscious that shape and reshape our human social existence, including our technological systems. These constructs project individual divisions and desires, such as gods and concepts of entities with superpower. Even flying discs in the ancient world, I think it comes up at one point in the video, much like drones, are the consequence of the entangled relationship with our internal psyche and our outwardly shared mythologies. So I can't help but to link the drone to the mythological iconography of the winged discs appearing in the ancient worlds as early as the 26th century BC. The circular form, flanked with two wings, appear in Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and Persia. Around 500 BC, the winged disc is morphed with the human figure, becoming central in the Zoroastrian iconography as Faravahar or Furuhar, a figure that up to today remains in Persepolis and is a common national symbol. The Furuhar defines the individual spirit, both conscious and unconscious, enmeshed with winged apparatus, producing an animate structure carrying spirit. The winged disc exemplifies our fantasy to shape technological objects with our myths of superpower to fly and defy gravity, be all-seeing, see through things, shift time, shapeshift, move quickly through space, be in two places at once, win wars, and so on. These objects expand from us, shaping our material world. Our species utilizes the state of myths and fantasy to sustain plasticity and evolve with beings and things as extensions of our humanness. McLuhan famously noted technology is extension of men. But here, in the context of this discussion, we can perhaps begin to consider a definition of technology that relinquishes this extension, existing as its own spirit apart from men. In this way, intelligence and agency projects onto synthetic systems that emerge beyond what is human. Drones today operate by remote human controllers are the literal extension of man, human vision, sensing, and militarized power. But the drone's future, with capacity for multiplicity, autonomous control, and cognitive capability, is shaping its evolution severed from the human, and thus occupying another form of existence as an assemblage within its own environment and intelligence, cooperating, communicating, and calibrating common goals as swarm. The entity that emerges made up of parts to make a whole is both intelligent and perhaps can even consider its own being as intelligent, and so of spirit. Okay, so if the drone becomes of spirit, then how do we reevaluate its capabilities? In this last section, I want to reflect on drone vision, specifically how it activates two modes of sight, seeing and the gaze. And I think a lot of the works we saw earlier today and in the art projects presented kind of reflected on this ability of drone vision and also the problematics. Machine vision has produced the possibility of seeing and also being seen through the lens of the other. Drone vision captures new perspectives through its line of flight, moving along nerves and splines, swarming through our atmosphere and vertical space to capture information that is neither the God's eye view of the satellite nor the human view of the horizontal gaze. Toy drones take selfies from various angles. Surveillance drones monitor us. Adventure drones give us visual access to inaccessible terrains. And cinematic drones target our imagination. In these drone lines of sight, we are able to see the world different and also to see ourselves differently through it, seeing from new vectors of vision. Drone vision creates a spatial topology that allows for the simultaneous possibility of seeing while being seen, and so producing self-recognition through the other. Currently, this exchange is programmed by humans, and so an expected image is produced as a reflection, but from new vantage points. However, as I was suggesting earlier, as a drone attains what I have so far defined as spirit, a kind of self-reflective intelligence, then the question might arise, will it show us an element of surprise? How will this seeing being then that sees on its own terms as intelligent and of spirit then see us? And what if it sees us, but it doesn't see us quite in the same way as we see ourselves? So when it becomes truly machine, as an autonomous cognitive spirit, it will not necessarily give us the expected image of ourself back to us. In psychoanalysis, the shift in perspective and disruption in the continuity of our own imagined image breaks the narcissistic closure, meaning the wholeness of the image we see of ourselves through the mirror stage when a perfect reflection gazes back, in this instance, is morphed. In topological terms, a kink occurs in the sphere of our psychological space through the image of the other produced by this otherly gaze from the outside. We narrate myths of gods who produce us in their own image. Now in this techno-turn, we have produced machines as extensions of that image, extensions of our myths and gods. But in addition, we are entangled with the desire for it to produce an image of us back to us. Finally, I want to distinguish the ability of the autonomous drone swarm to both produce vision, so this image back to us, as well as produce gaze, the act of being seen. Vision requires eyes, machine or biological, whereas the gaze is detached from producing an image and is the phenomenon of being seen. The gaze is a fantasy projection of the big other as a symbolic social system that cannot be defined at a singular point of sight. Rather, it is an infrastructure of an awareness of an outside that sees us. and so defining the I as that which is being seen. Gods were never looking at us. Rather, the social construct of God's looking produced the active gaze of the big other. Now the big other's gaze, distributed through the autonomous drone swarm and other technologies of vision, produce an assemblage of multifarious gazes, aligned with the same fiction of our past mythologies. The gaze requires multiplicity, and the speculative future of autonomous drone swarm can embody this shifting singular vantage point of sight, maintaining the network condition of the gaze from above. The drone gaze repeats our entangled myth and necessary fantasy for multiplicity in the gaze of the big other. As Lacan famously says, quote, "I see only from one point, but in my existence, I'm looked at from all sides." As we compose apparatuses of vision and gazing, these technological objects become our mythological projections that shape spirit, and the spirit inversely folds back and gazes back at us. I want to end with a little story from a Persian poet, Attar. He's a 12th century Persian Sufi poet who writes the famous story, The Conference of the Birds. So this is sort of my condensed version of this journey. The story recounts a large group of birds in search of a transcendental leader. Gathered, they choose a mythological creature, the Simurgh, a bird beyond birds, entangled, enlightened, otherworldly, with expansive wings and an intellectual mind. Convinced by their decision, the group of birds set off on a journey in search of the Simurgh. They journey over 7 valleys, at each stage shedding something of a human trait, challenged internally as well as by external drifts. So one by one, the birds drop out, unable to fulfill the challenging journey. Eventually, only 30 birds reach the land of Simurgh. But instead of finding their mythical leader, all they see is their own reflection in the lake. In that moment, they realize that a metamorphosis has occurred through their desire for seeking a leader to unify them. In this process, they realize that the leader they sought to find is the evolution of their own consciousness, a misrecognition that the leader is the outside rather than emergent from within. Si literally translates to 30 and morgh to bird. They were always Simurgh, awakened by a journey that bound them as a collective becoming of spirit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ala.
Sure.
Do we have Sam? So we're going to, I guess, get Sam back via Skype, and maybe I'll lead by just saying that at some point I will ask whether the three of you have any questions for each other. I think that while this panel has a kind of element of whiplash to it, which I think is a little bit exciting, I think it's kind of meaningful to see these different disciplinary values, methodologies, and languages sitting next to each other so closely. Ala, I mean, this was a really dense kind of poetic work that you've shared with us, so thank you for that. It seemed to be grounded in a type of mythologizing of the drone, and thank you for helping us to kind of like, or inviting us to kind of like not imagine it being regular, but imagine it being something different. Mm-hmm. So I think that was a really nice work that you did with that. There's something, I mean, I guess a kind of text I've been dipping into a little bit this semester has been Mythologies by Roland Barthes, and where he analyzes very kind of normal things, or where he analyzed very normal things and then tried to understand them as a kind of instantiation of a dominant ideology. And this is a kind of interesting intersection maybe between your two works, Ciara, where you kind of have very carefully mapped the relations between a kind of military kind of industry and the active regulation. And so presumably within that, there's a kind of chain of a dominant position that is getting entrenched through kind of regulatory decisions. And then it's through Hillary's work before, there was this idea of disposition in technology, and I think a conversation that would be great to have with Sam is around how engineering kind of establishes that disposition and produces that bias. So those are just like some quick reactions, and hopefully they make sense in some kind of way.
I have a follow-up. I don't know if it responds exactly to that, but one reaction that I had to something Sam said and that Hillary said earlier was about the word drone. So how they don't want to use the word drone, they want to use the word unmanned aerial vehicle. I actually insist on using the word drone because I think that the various stakeholders want us to not use that word because of its negative connotation, because it makes us think of those relations of power. And yes, the drones that we do have in the domestic space are not lethal drones, but they do still have that power imbalance and that asymmetry. And they do still have the potential to do terrible things. Very good things as well. I mean, I'm not against the technologies at all, but I think using the word drone and normalizing that is important when we talk about the technology. And I just found that interesting that they both said, you know, that was something they struggled with or that they wanted to clarify.
Thank you for joining us, Sam.
Yeah, thank you.
Did you hear that brief interlude after Ala's presentation?
I did, yeah. So I was listening to the live stream. I definitely think the word drone is problematic. And, you know, I think the only reason we didn't avoid it for our research project is it gets the attention or recognition of the general public better, if that makes sense. Even if we don't think it's the best.
Where does your discomfort come from?
Well, because we're not dealing with drones. I mean, drones are aircraft developed in the early 20s to be shot down for practice. I mean, that's technically what a drone is. So that's not at all what we're researching. We're researching things like use of air mobility taxis and material internet and things like that. So I think, you know, perception is super, and there are definitely risks in its use of this technology. So I think it's really important to have the discussions that we're having now and with an interdisciplinary audience. It reminds me of perhaps this audience is aware of C.P. Snow's work, The Two Cultures. And I think the more you can get the two cultures together, obviously an organization like ours representing more of the technical, predominantly technical point rather than how the technology winds up being used. But we also created our research project to directly address some of the perceptions and also deal with security and safety issues.
Can I make a little, maybe it's, I don't know, I have a difficult time maybe plugging into this very technical and very in-depth sort of discussion on drone in terms of security, but if I could maybe think about the word drone or the problematics of the word and thinking how it emerged as sort of a reference to like this buzzing bee and sort of its sort of sonic qualities being how the name of it emerged, and now we have a totally different imagination when someone says drones because of how it's been employed in sort of militarized warfare. But then one of the clips that I included in the video was from Black Mirror, so this swarm of bees again that come to life, that become a killing machine. And I just wonder, and I don't really have an answer to this, but how our sort of popular culture and the new images that might emerge of this object, this autonomous, flying, buzzing, they were still quite buzzing as a sonic technology. So I wonder how that might start to reshape how we think about it and how we do use the word. So.
It's when you brought up the buzzing, as we hear the buzzing of the technology around us. There have been countless studies done in Gaza of the effects of the sound of drones. So never mind all the other damage, but the effect of the sound, merely the sound of the drones that they have on young children, especially, and they've been doing specifically auditory studies with them. And so, in a way, we can, I think it's not so far or divorced from the reality of this sort of, this hum of sort of this forward march of technology. And I think that if I can pull out a thread, if you'll allow me, Simon, from today, that struck me, was this sort of, perhaps a searching almost for a kind of hermeticness in terms of the idea of trying to find something a little bit more circular rather than the separation between things. I think it's the separation where John started this morning was saying, the Enlightenment project of the separation between object and subject has brought us to the mess that we're in. And I think that, listening carefully to all of the papers and some of the comments is that if we can start to think about more of a connectedness and more of hermetics between earth and sky, which is where, in fact, John started with the fog, if you remember, then perhaps we can come to a place in which, through teasing out these things, that we can, find that slowness that we're looking for, perhaps, but also pull back from the marketing of the drones and the good, the bad, and the ugly, and it seems to me that there's a certain kind of it seems